Just the facts, ma'am.
Hey all, in this video we're going to talk about whether North Korea really does have the capability to hit the US with a nuclear EMP. And I bring this up because I've seen a lot of people online, including popular YouTube channels, saying that the idea is ridiculous. There's no way they could possibly touch the US. There seems to be two mindsets for the groups that think that way. The first group takes a position that North Korea is a paper dragon. They're run by a fat lunatic. They can't even get their missiles to launch properly, so they're far too incompetent to be able to launch an EMP attack. The second group seems to come from the position that says, this is America. We got the greatest military on earth. We're untouchable. There's nothing they could possibly do to harm us. In both cases, if you ask these folks, well, why specifically do you think that it's not possible? They don't have an answer because they've done absolutely no research whatsoever into the topic. So, I'm going to show you some of the research I've done. I'm going to show you some clips from experts in the field, and you can decide yourself whether you think it is a realistic risk. Let's start off with a clip from a talk that Newt Gingrich gave to the Senate. This was in May of this year, and then we'll move on from there.
The effect potentially of either a series of local EMP attacks or a high-altitude EMP attack, you're talking about a catastrophic event from which conceivably you couldn't recover for years. So I would assert a couple of quick things. One, the Congress should look at EMP attacks as one of the three great threats to our survival, the other two being cyber warfare and nuclear weapons.
Now, the next document I'm going to show you is a little bit dry, but it is in fact very important to be able to understand the background to this story. This is a report by the Subcommittee on Terrorism, Technology, and Homeland Security presented to Congress in March of 2005. In 2004, the EMP Commission met with very senior Russian military officers who are experts on EMP weapons. They warned that Russian scientists had been recruited by Pyongyang to work on the North Korean nuclear weapons program. They further warned that the knowledge and technology to develop super EMP weapons had been transferred to North Korea, and that North Korea could probably develop these weapons in the near future within a few years. The Russian officer said that the threat to global security that would be posed by a North Korea armed with super EMP weapons is unacceptable. And this article goes on to say that in 2004 they not only recruited Russian scientists, but they also recruited scientists from China and Pakistan for their nuclear program. In 2006, North Korea conducted its first nuclear test. It was dismissed by the press as a failure because of its very low yield, only 1 to 3 kilotons. But it looked to the EMP Commission like a super EMP weapon because such a weapon would have a very low yield, being designed to produce gamma rays, which creates the EMP shock effect, not a big explosion. Most of North Korea's nuclear tests have been low-yield devices. And again, here is another Newsmax article stating that in 2009 there was another nuclear test that appeared to be a super EMP weapon capable of emitting enough gamma rays to disable the electrical power grid across most of the lower 48 states. And here is another article. According to South Korea's National Intelligence Service, North Korea has purchased EMP weaponry from Russia and is now developing its own in-house version. I believe what they actually purchased were old Russian EMPs that were headed to the scrap heap, and North Korea wants to reuse the housings. And then in 2013, a Pentagon report came out, and the new assessment by the Pentagon's intelligence arm has concluded for the first time with moderate confidence that North Korea has learned how to make a nuclear weapon small enough to be delivered by a ballistic missile. Now keep in mind, if you don't plan to fix a problem, the natural reaction is to say, no, it's not that bad, we don't need to do anything about it today, and that's exactly what the Obama administration did. They downplayed it, they said, we really don't know for sure, and they did nothing as a result. And this was 4 years ago. And there was a flurry of articles in 2016, this one stating, with the recent success of a submarine-launched nuclear missile, North Korea has proven their nuclear weapons development is moving faster than expected. Now, please note, miniaturization is very important. I am certainly no expert on nuclear weapons, but from what I've read, apparently a super EMP is a very small neutron or H-bomb. as opposed to the larger conventional type bombs from the Starfish Prime era. So by the fact that they are able to make it small enough suggests that it is a super EMP, and also it has to be delivered. Either has to be put on a missile and shot up into the atmosphere to detonate at the right height, or alternatively it could be smuggled into a country covertly and set off at ground level. So you need to decide based on what I've shown you whether you think it's a realistic risk that they have developed a super EMP. Personally, I give it at least 50-50. The second question, of course, would be how would they deliver it? How would they actually strike the U.S., which we'll get into in a minute. But the one thing I think is important to note is the motivation for them to hit the U.S. is extremely strong. And this is not just because Kim Jong-un is crazy. No, it's a lot more than that. There is a lot of history here. And when you understand the history, you'll understand their constant obsession with the U.S. and why we would be their #1 target if a conflict broke out. The U.S. utterly devastated North Korea during the last couple of years of the war with constant bombing. Of course, it was really a proxy war between the U.S. and China and Russia, and North Korea was being decimated in the middle. The U.S. bombed everything. They bombed the cities, the towns, the villages. Pyongyang only had a couple of modern buildings left standing. All the people had actually moved underground to avoid the constant bombing. At that point, when there were no targets left, the U.S. decided to bomb their hydroelectric dams, knowing full well that it would cause the farmers would no longer be able to irrigate their rice fields, and it would lead to mass starvation. So in the U.S.'s mind, it would put more pressure on China and Russia if the people started starving, because they would have to supply food. Now, please keep in mind, the war has never ended, technically. We've had a ceasefire, but the war was never declared over. So for the last 60 years, the North Koreans have been preparing for the Yankees to come back and do it again. And that has created this whole war-obsessed death cult in their culture, where they put all of their energy into creating arms, to developing nuclear weapons, to prepare for the day when the Yankees come back and to try to destroy them. So when you think about who the target is, they don't care about South Korea or Japan or Australia. They care about hitting the U.S. We're the ones they want. We're the ones they've been obsessing over for the last 60 years. And let me clarify that by saying I don't think North Korea has ever planned on launching a first strike against the U.S. I think their plans have always been based on when the U.S. hits them. Now, people may say, but the U.S. has tried to negotiate with them numerous times over their nuclear weapons program. And while, yes, that is partially true, in fact, a lot of sources will tell you that in each case when the U.S. did have an agreement to lessen the sanctions, to work towards normalizing the relationship, it's been the U.S. that has backed out, not North Korea. And the reason the U.S. continually backed out was because each time the administration decided that the regime was going to collapse very soon anyway. So it's a better idea to keep the sanctions on, to keep the pressure on, to hasten that collapse. Of course, that's been the plan for the last 20 years, and things didn't work out the way they expected to. Now, I know some people are going to be thinking that this little recap sounds rather anti-American, so let me state for the record, I am a U.S. citizen. I love America. I have been born here, bred here. I voted for Trump. However, when I see the corrupt things that our government does, when I see the constant lies and the fact the media covers up for them, it really makes me angry. There are always two sides to every story, and both sides need to be told. So now that we've established that they are very motivated to hit the U.S. if a war breaks out, the next question would be, how would they actually be able to deliver the payload to hit the U.S. mainland? And I honestly think that's the easy part. If they can develop it, they can figure out a way to get it over here. Originally, I was very concerned about the two North Korean satellites, and that's what started me doing all this research. After looking at it, I started thinking it's not really that big of a threat. They only have 2 satellites. It would be very easy for the U.S. to shoot them down or manipulate them. And in addition, why would North Korea put all this effort into developing something and then put all their eggs in that little basket? Especially when there are far easier ways to deliver it and far more reliable ways. So on that note, they certainly wouldn't need an intercontinental ballistic missile to do it. There's a number of options. But here I'm going to switch to some statements made by James Woolsey on this topic that you may find interesting.
Because it's very hard to attack a specific target with a ballistic missile. You have to re-enter, you have to have accuracy, so forth. But if all you have to do is detonate while it's in orbit, You launch it into orbit and it detonates. You could have a very substantial share of the U.S. Go down from the EMP. But we are behind. On the combative side of EMP, we're behind the Russians and the Chinese and quite possibly even the North Koreans, since they have relatively little electronic gear to protect.
So if they wanted to attack the U.S. with an EMP, how would they do it? Well, they could launch it from a freighter off the coast. They could launch it with one of their nuclear submarines. They could smuggle it into the country. Now, you may be thinking, but we have these fancy anti-ballistic systems set up, so that we'd shoot it down if they tried to launch something. Well, no, because we're really set up to be intercepting ICBMs coming from Russia or China, wherever. In the case if there's just a ship sitting off the coast and it sends a missile straight up into the air, that's going to be really hard to hit. In addition, everyone knows which areas we're covering with those systems, so you just go to another area that's not covered. So I think that would be very easy. Alternatively, they could smuggle it into the country. It wouldn't be as effective if it had to be detonated at ground level, but they probably already know which power plants to hit, and if they could knock out a handful of power plants, they could cause a cascading effect that would take out huge areas. So they smuggle them in. They're small. That's an option. And there's certainly been numerous cases of them smuggling things. There was a case with the Panama Canal where they stopped a North Korean vessel and they discovered it had 2 MiG fighter jets and a couple of missiles, Cuban missiles on it, buried under sacks of sugar. Come to find out, the Cubans sold them the equipment under the guise that they claimed they were sending it to North Korea to be fixed. So there's numerous ways they could definitely get it into the country if they wanted to, and I'm sure they've worked these problems out quite a while ago, since they've been thinking about this for a heck of a long time. Newt Gingrich did a good job of summing up the seriousness of this situation in his talk regarding EMPs last May.
This is like 9/11, where everybody said, gee, we hadn't thought about an airplane hitting a building, which is nonsense. Tom Clancy had written about it a decade earlier. But nobody wanted to cut through and say, so what would you have to do to stop that from happening? After the event, we did all sorts of things to make it harder to take over an airplane. Well, we're in the same boat right now, except here we're gambling our civilization.
So that pretty much wraps it up. I will say, if anyone thinks they may be feeling anxious as things start to heat up with North Korea over the possibility of an EMP, there is something you can do if you have an interest, and that would be to store a couple of weeks of food and water, or more if possible. The reason being, if there was a strike, there's a pretty good chance it would be regional. You wouldn't know that at the time. It would take a while to find out. But if it was regional, there eventually would be help coming. So if you did have supplies, if you could avoid getting killed in mob violence and the chaos that ensued, you could get through it reasonably well. On the other hand, if the entire U.S. grid was taken down, then yeah, it would be game over. Most of the people would end up dead. At some point, of course, the Chinese, I'm sure, would invade, so there would be some stability down the line, but they would be interested in the natural resources and the land. They wouldn't have much interest in the U.S. population as a whole. So, on that note, if you enjoyed this video, please give me a thumbs up. Thank you so much for watching, and stay safe.